Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. One of the really useful things that we gained from the publication of the letters between Sir John Kerr and the Palace in 1974 and 1975 is an understanding of what was being discussed by politicians, the media, and the public at the time. This is because Kerr often attached news clippings to his letters to the Palace. Now, you'll sometimes read authors saying how outrageous it was that Kerr was contemplating the dismissal of the Whitlam government even before supply was deferred in the Senate when there were no grounds for dismissal. They paint a picture of a man who became Governor-General with the sole purpose of bringing down a government that appointed him. They also portray a naive and innocent government which had no idea that the Governor-General could or might consider dismissing it if it could not achieve the passage of supply. They argue that the Whitlam government had no chance to plan tactics or how to respond and was caught completely unawares. The Palace letters, which are all available on the National Archives website, show quite a different picture. The first time the notion of dismissal is raised in those letters is not by Kerr personally, but by him passing on a media report. And we also see that Whitlam's office was wargaming dismissal scenarios well before supply was deferred by the Senate. So in this episode, I'm going to go through some of the Palace letters. Now, they were, of course, contemporaneous records written without knowing what the outcome would be. And I'm going to look at them to give you an idea of what people were talking and strategizing about before the coalition announced on the 16th of October 1975 that it would defer the passage of supply. Because the Senate had proposed to block supply back in 1974, but this was overtaken by a double dissolution election, the prospect of the blocking of supply was frequently discussed after the 1974 election. And this was so even before Fraser became leader of the opposition on the 21st of March 1975. Kerr's letter to the Palace on the 4th of January 1975, which is largely about the reconstruction of Darwin following Cyclone Tracy, notes that enormous sums of money will need to be appropriated to fund the reconstruction and that they could be mixed in with other appropriations, quote, in such a way as to make it more difficult for supply to be blocked, unquote. He noted that the government is working on ways and means apart altogether from the Darwin difficulties to make it hard for the opposition to deny supply. He then went on to discuss a meeting that he had with Sir Robert Menzies on Menzies' 80th birthday. Menzies had said that he thought Fraser would challenge Snedden for the leadership of the Liberal Party. Kerr reported that Menzies, quote, has misgivings about the use of supply to achieve an election this year, but he thinks that if one is held, the government will be defeated. In a letter dated the 24th of March 1975, Kerr explained how everyone had been expecting a mid-year election and that when he left for an overseas trip, Whitlam indicated that he hoped to ensure the timing of the election so that it took place in July 1975. But the political focus then shifted to the leader of the opposition, Billy Snedden, and his inadequate leadership. Snedden announced that there would be no denial of supply and no early election. Snedden was then challenged for the leadership by Fraser, and Fraser won. Fraser, however, wanted to consolidate his leadership before launching an attack on the government. Supply battles and the prospect of an election were therefore deferred. By July 1975, the loans affair had blown up, and the Treasurer, Jim Cairns, had been dismissed. And I'll discuss that dismissal in a later video. This was the point at which the press started speculating about the dismissal of the Whitlam government. An editorial in the Canberra Times on the 4th of July 1975 said the following, quote, the ultimate guardian of the Constitution, of the rule of law and of the customary usages of the Australian government in a time of crisis is the Governor-General, who has certain clear powers to check an elected government. He normally acts on the advice of his ministers, but there are occasions when he need not seek or accept that advice. He could, for good and sufficient reasons, revoke the commissions of a Prime Minister or other ministers. It's within his power to take steps that could lead to a dissolution of the Parliament and to a general election, unquote. It suggested that this may be necessary for the good government of Australia in a time of grave economic disruption. Kerr, in a letter to the Palace, said that he had no intention, of course, of acting in the way suggested. He said there's ample room for the democratic process still to unfold. It's important to note here that this first reference in these letters to dismissal arose in the context of Kerr dismissing media speculation on the subject. Kerr told the Palace that the combination of the loans affair and the dismissal of Cairns, along with Labor's loss of the Bass by-election, meant that the stage was set for a possible election by the end of the year. Kerr noted that while Fraser had previously said that a government should be permitted to serve its term and should not be brought down other than in extraordinary circumstances, the various scandals engulfing the Whitlam government had given Fraser ample room to argue that extraordinary circumstances had emerged. He pointed out that the only way Fraser could bring the government down was by using the Senate to deny its supply. He speculated that this could lead to an election in early December. On the 25th of July, Kerr told the Palace that if supply is denied during the budget debate, Parliament would be dissolved in late October or early November. He clearly expected the same approach by Whitlam as had occurred in 1974, that is, the calling of either a general election or a double dissolution. He was not contemplating dismissal, but that an early election would be called instead because it was forced by the Senate denying supply. On the 29th of August, after the budget was handed down, Kerr reported to the Palace that the Prime Minister was anticipating an election on the 5th of December if supply were denied. Now, note here that it was Whitlam who was anticipating the early election, as he had also done earlier in the year. Fraser, however, announced that while the opposition would criticise the budget, no election would be precipitated this year unless some unexpected and serious change occurred. In September 1975, however, the atmosphere changed. The Whitlam government was polling badly, and Kerr noted that he was reasonably sure that Whitlam believed his party would lose government if an election was held, so instead he would tough it out. Kerr said that the press was reporting that if supply was denied by the Senate, Whitlam would not advise a dissolution. He would continue to govern without supply and sheet responsibility for the consequence back to the opposition for rejecting supply. Kerr said that there would be a battle in the country about who is responsible for the ensuing mess, failure to meet obligations to pay public servants, the Defence Forces, and so on. It seems likely that the tough it out message was being briefed to the press by Whitlam's office. Kerr also told the Palace that the Australian Financial Review had sent him questions about his constitutional role in such a conflict. While he declined to reply to the press, he said that he was keeping his mind open on the constitutional issues and giving it careful thought. He speculated that what was going on may be merely psychological warfare. It was hard to tell, he thought. By mid-September, the wargaming on Whitlam's side had begun in earnest. First, Whitlam floated with Kerr on the 15th of September the idea that if the supply bills were blocked, he would present them to the Governor-General for royal assent, having only passed the lower house. Now, I'm going to deal with that one in a separate video because it raises discrete constitutional issues. But in the end, Whitlam didn't pursue it. At the same time, Whitlam raised an alternative scenario. He said that if supply ran out and public servants were not being paid, there would be no point in dismissing him. And this was because Fraser would not be able to secure supply either, as he would not have a majority in the lower house. Whitlam accepted, however, that it might be possible for Fraser to revive a rejected supply bill that had been passed by the lower house and then pass it on to the Senate. So he recognised that there was a potential flaw in this scenario. Kerr, however, speculated in his letter to the palace that if neither side could get supply and public servants were not being paid, only an election could resolve the matter. If Whitlam were not prepared to advise one, then Kerr might have to appoint someone else who would. He said he'd keep an open mind on the matter, but he also said that a lot of bluff was involved and that the situation may well resolve itself. An editorial in the Australian Financial Review on the 15th of September reported that Whitlam had said that he would not call an election for the House of Representatives if supply was blocked, while Fraser, in response, claimed that this was arrant nonsense and that if Whitlam failed to call an election after the rejection of the budget, the Governor-General would be forced to dismiss him. This put dismissal into the realm of public discussion in September 1975. The Australian Financial Review noted that such action would cause a major constitutional crisis and that conventions had already been trampled on both sides, resulting in what it called bushranger politics becoming the order of the day. It was the National Times of the same date that was more revealing, however. It said that Whitlam had adopted the McGarr theorem. It was that instead of going to an election when supply is blocked and then reaching an agreement with the opposition to fund the government during the election period, as occurred in 1974, the government should announce beforehand that it would not make any arrangement for supply and allow it to run out, blaming the opposition for the consequences. Whitlam's office, in off-the-record briefings, told the media that this was now Whitlam's firm strategy. The National Times observed that it was essentially a bluff and intended to ward off any blockage of supply by the opposition. On the 20th of September, Peter Bowers in the Sydney Morning Herald revealed active wargaming by Whitlam's advisers. And this is what Bowers said, quote, "Here is the constitutional scenario Mr. Whitlam's advisers are scripting of events that would follow the denial of supply. With Whitlam refusing to call an election, the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, would assume a crucial role. Mr. Whitlam, the script goes, would advise Sir John that he had no intention of surrendering his commission so that an election could be held. Sir John accepts Mr. Whitlam's advice that the blocking of supply is unjustified and then summons Mr. Fraser. Sir John asks Mr. Fraser if he can form a government, to which Mr. Fraser replies that he lacks the necessary majority in the House of Representatives. Sir John then advises Mr. Fraser to allow supply to pass. Mr. Whitlam cannot see Mr. Fraser defying the moral right of the Crown. It would be a breathtaking gamble of Whitlam-esque proportion, but anyone who thinks Mr. Whitlam is bluffing does not know the man. He has lived dangerously all his political life," unquote. This scenario, which Whitlam's office fed the press, is bizarre on a number of levels. First, it assumes that the Governor-General, in asking Fraser if he could form a government, would dismiss Whitlam to do so. There's no vacancy that can be filled until the holder of the office of Prime Minister has either resigned or died or been dismissed. Second, it assumes that Fraser would refuse the chance to form a government and advise an immediate election. Third, it assumes that Kerr would use the authority of the Crown to instruct a democratically elected House of Parliament to pass supply, which is quite an extraordinary assumption. Now, this same scenario was also fed to Graham Williams in The Australian on the 18th of September 1975. But Williams had the good sense to ask Professor Geoffrey Saw, a constitutional expert, about it. Now, Saw popped it like a pin in a balloon. He pointed out that the Governor-General could appoint Fraser as Prime Minister simply for the purpose of advising the Governor-General to dissolve the lower house and call an election. He saw this as a way to end the deadlock. He pointed out that it would be better from Whitlam's point of view if Whitlam called a double dissolution election because it would raise the chance of him being able to control the Senate. Saw was spot on about the Governor-General appointing Fraser as Prime Minister in such circumstances, because this is precisely what actually happened. Fraser didn't reject a commission on the ground that he had no majority in the House of Representatives. Rather, he accepted a commission to form a caretaker government on the basis that he would advise an election to allow the people to break the deadlock, and also to secure the passage of supply in the meantime. Whitlam's advisors must have been reading the newspaper reports about the wargaming scenarios that they were briefing to the press. They can hardly claim to have been surprised by this outcome, given that it was reported in a major newspaper on the 18th of September 1975, quoting from one of the leading constitutional lawyers in the country. It wasn't a case of not realising that this could happen from a constitutional point of view. It was instead an assessment by Whitlam that Kerr was too weak to do this, which caused the blind spot in Labor's strategy. On the 30th of September, Kerr reported to the Palace that Whitlam's latest tactic was to propose a half-Senate election if supply were blocked. While the new senators would not take up office until the following 1st of July, which would be far too late to address the supply crisis, the two casual vacancies in New South Wales and Queensland would be filled immediately once the election writs were returned. Now, at that stage, in writing this letter, the outcome of a constitutional challenge to the territory senators was as yet unknown. But Kerr explained to the Palace that it was the states which, under the Constitution, control the issue of the writs for half-Senate elections. Whitlam had told Kerr that the Conservative governments in New South Wales and Queensland might advise their governors not to issue the writs at that early stage, foiling any attempt to adjust the Senate numbers early. Whitlam said that while he thought the writs would probably be issued, he needed to give some thought to the possibility of a revolt in one or more of the states. The Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, responded to this letter on the 8th of October, noting that Whitlam's half-Senate election proposal seemed to be a much more reasonable one and therefore more likely to be used. He said, "I imagine you would have no constitutional difficulty in agreeing to a half-election of the Senate." But he was concerned about what would happen if the state premiers advised their governors not to issue the writs, and the extent to which the Governor-General might have to be involved in resolving that issue. Now, going back to Kerr's letter of the 30th of September, Kerr said he had asked what Whitlam would do about supply, which would run out during a half-Senate election if it was held. Whitlam doubted that supply would temporarily be granted by the coalition. He accepted that there would be a profound constitutional crisis once the money ran out, but he said that he would call for a vote of confidence from the House of Representatives and argue to Kerr that he is entitled to retain his commission for as long as he holds the confidence of the House, despite his failure to obtain supply. Whitlam seemed to accept that this was merely an argument and that the alternative was for Kerr to dismiss him. In his wargaming, he was relying on Kerr being compliant with his advice, but he was well aware of the importance of supply and the looming potential of his government's dismissal. Whitlam told Kerr that if he could make it through until the half-Senate election, he would put the appropriation bills to the Senate again. If they were not passed, he would then advise a double dissolution, but this could not take place at least until February 1976. By the time the Senate count was complete and the writs were returned and Parliament could then return to sitting and pass a budget, there would have been no supply from November 1975 until April 1976 at the earliest. Expecting a Governor-General to sit by and do nothing while the government had run out of money and public servants, the Defence Forces and contractors were not being paid from November until April was a very big gamble to take, especially in light of the history of governors and governors-general insisting that a dissolution will only be granted if there is supply to cover the election period. But, as Bowers said, Whitlam was prepared to live dangerously. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and join me next time for a video on Whitlam's alternative proposal to get the Governor-General to assent to the passage of supply without it being passed by the Senate. I'll see you then. Goodbye.